Hello, I'm Li Hao. Today we're going to talk about another type of binding, which is bind this. So what is bind this? Well, we shall see in this example over here. Over here, I have prepared a component which has an input and a button. So over here, if I type something in my input, you got that something from the input. Oftentimes when we write this, we assume that Svelte will understand this component, go through some compilation into JavaScript, and what the JavaScript do is to create that input element and insert it into the DOM. And most of the time you don't have to care about that element itself. You don't need to know like what. You don't need to get the reference of the elements, because if you want to manipulate, say, the value of that input, you use the bind value to bind the value of the input and you control from there. And most of the times you just want to control the value of the input, or maybe some validation which you can pass in via other attributes. But if for some circumstances you want to get the reference of the element, then you probably would want to use this, which is the bind this. So bind this allows you to bind variable. So let's say I'm creating a variable called element, and I want to bind this input. So this stands for this reference of this input to this variable. So bind this is actually one-way binding. You do this, you will bind the reference of the input to this variable, but it does not go the other way around. You can't go the way where you say update the value of this variable and hopes that it will somehow reflect on this element. No, it does not work that way. You can't say I have this element now and I want to create say a button element and hope that with this bind this I'll make this input into button. No, it does not work that way. It works only one way. Input, when it's on the screen, when Svelte creates it and add it onto the screen, then bind this will bind the reference of that input element to this variable called element. So hope that you hear the keyword over there. When the Svelte mounts this element, then you will get this, right? So which means that if you want to access the variable right now, if you console log element right now at this point of time, you probably will get undefined. And when does it being defined? Well, it's being defined when Svelte creates this element and mount it onto the DOM. So if you come over here on mount, so on mount is a lifecycle that allows you to register a lifecycle event when an element is mounted, when the component is mounted. Then I can call at that point of time the element should be available. You don't have to worry about on mount. We'll talk about it later. But as you can see over here, I can say type of element, and you can see it's something, it's object, right? So the Svelte REPL does not allow me to print out element reference. But if I come over here and open up the elements tab, you would see that it is console out as an input, right? The reference of the input. So what can you do with it? So let me comment this out. What can you do with it? Well, you can do something. Since you access the reference of the elements, now you can do anything with it. You can say reset the value of the input, which conveniently we have this function called reset, and this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to say reset. I'm going to reset it to just an empty string. Okay, so if I come over here, I type something, and at this point, at this juncture, you can see that element has mounted. Most likely the reference to that input is already assigned to this variable called element. So if I come over here, when I click reset, it will, this is elements, not inputs. Right. At this point, most likely the element is pointing to the input. So when I say the element.value equals to empty, you expect that you will clears up this input, right? So when I click, it clears up. Right. So this is what you can do with reference to the element. So anytime when you want to get a reference of an element, you use bind this. And as a lot of things in Svelte, components work similar to elements. So if I say you can use bind this to elements, you can use bind this to component as well. So if I come over here, I prepared a component, so I'm going to import it. Let's say import component from component.svelte, and then I'm going to create this component over here. And okay, I'm going to still keep this variable called element, but you know that I'm going to bind this to bind this component, right? So this element is going to point to the reference of the component. So can I say bind this element? Again, this is a one-way binding. So you only get the reference of the components on this variable when this component is mounted on the screen. You can't say the other way around where changing this variable in hopes that change something on the component itself. But of course, this component over here that I'm going to show you now have variables, right? A state called count. So when I click this button, it will increment the count, and also it exposes a props, right? So props can be variables, can be functions. In this case, the props is a function. Why I say you can be anything is like you can come over here and do this. It's like a props, but it's a function, right? This is similar to this, right? You're exporting something like a props, which is a function. So you can come over here and get a reference of this component, which means you also you get the reference of this component, which means that you can access all the props from this instance of this component. So anything that's exported can be accessed. Say for example, if I export the count as a props, and if I come over here and I say console log elements.count, okay, so 2 right now, you click, you expect that, oh, what shit. Sorry. So I can't really read it like this except unless I pass in this flag over here. So don't worry about Svelte options accessors. This is something we will talk about later on. But as the warning shows, it's clear enough, you just copy paste this thing in, and now you can see that we can get we can console out this count over here, right? A basic explanation of what this is that it allows us to compile this component in a way that you can access props with this directly with these accessors using like getter function to get the props value, right? Of course, however, if you look at functions, you don't need that. You don't use accessors like getters to get the value of the props. You call the function directly. So over here, instead, I could replace this with elements.reset, and we export this function called resets, which it will reset the counts to 0. So if I click a few numbers over here, and when I click reset, it will use the reference of this component and call a method on that component. We'll call the props function, which is this reset over here, right? And so I call this reset, and this will be called this function, and it will set the counts to 0. So when I click reset, it will reset the value to 0. And when I click now, it does resets to 0. And there you have it. Why, if you ask me why you need a reference of a component, this is the reason. You can access to any methods of the components, then you unlocks yourself not just control the components via its props, you can also control the components via its methods. You can export more functions, more methods from this exports, a lot of functions, which will be like a methods of this component. And once you get the reference of a component, you can call all these methods, and it will in some sense control your internal state, right? So in this case, if I want to set the counts to 0, I need to have a props. I need to pass in count equals to a variable somewhere, and then a different count, and then you set it to 0, right? And if I have more than that, I have a group of props, then I would have to coordinate them out here. But if I get a reference of this component and I can call a methods to do all of that at once, then isn't that great? Right, so bind this allows you to get the reference of the element or the components that you're binding. Right, so if you use on the elements, you get the reference of that element. If you get you use it on the components, you get the reference of the component. And when do you get the reference? You get it when that element or the component is mounted. It's created and mounted by Svelte. And this bind this is a one-way binding, which means that it will, when it's mounted, it will update the variable, but updating the variable itself does not goes back to change the element or component itself. So hope that's clear. If you have any questions, comments down below. And as always, give me a like if you like this video, and subscribe to my channel so that you get notified when the next one is out. So see ya, bye bye.